The theme of my lecture this evening is design and art to and fro, because Francesca and Gianluigi wanted me to talk about the relationship of art and design. And it is a fascinating subject. If ever I'm rash enough to admit to anyone that I write about design for a living, there are certain questions they always ask. One is, what is design? Which is always a bit of a nightmare, very complicated to answer. And another is about the relationship between design and art. And that, of course, is very complicated too, because the relationship between the two disciplines has changed constantly throughout history. But I think it's fair to say that it has rarely been as ambiguous as it is right now. It's become so common for people to talk about the boundaries between art and design being blurred that it's become a rather boring cliche to do so. And yet I would argue that it's more important than ever at this point to acknowledge the differences between them. And this is because at a time when society faces so many complex, daunting, even terrifying challenges, we need to make the most of design's power and art's power to help us to navigate them. And in order to do that, we need to have a much clearer, more nuanced understanding of both disciplines, including the differences between them. So I thought it would be helpful to begin by defining what I mean by design and art, because both words began from the same root. In ancient Greece, they were both referred to as techne, a word that described all the crafts, plus medicine and music. And it wasn't until the Renaissance and the Middle Ages that artists began to elevate their status from other crafts, and the first art schools opened here in Italy. Then, and for centuries to come, and I'm going to generalize here, artists were generally perceived as being engaged in the pursuit of beauty and perfection, often in work they made themselves. But since the early 20th century, that of course has changed, because since the dawn of abstraction and conceptualism, artists have increasingly explored the messier, darker, more disturbing aspects of life. They've also worked across an ever more eclectic range of media, no longer necessarily making things themselves or even seeking to control the outcome. So as a result, and at the risk of gross oversimplification, it seems to me that the first 10 words that appear, if you type "what is art" into Google search, are broadly correct, and they're these. What is art? The expression or application of human creative skill and imagination. Whereas if you put "what is design" into Google search, a definition comes up that is far less satisfactory. It's much the same as the definition of design that would have occurred to people when the first art schools opened in 16th century Italy, a plan or a drawing. Because design is much, much, much more difficult to define. Design can indeed mean a plan or a drawing, but many, many other things too. It's an incredibly complex, often elusive phenomenon that's changed dramatically over the centuries at different times and in different contexts. And the more meanings it has acquired, the slipperier and more confusing it has become, because many of the new interpretations sit very oddly with the old ones. Now, the British design historian John Heskett, who sadly died last year, once compared the difficulty of defining design to doing the same thing for love. And it's a brilliant illusion, because love can mean anything from tender affection, lifelong devotion, unbridled lust, or a destructive obsession. And similarly, design can mean many, many things, from a minute technical detail, a plan or a drawing, to a $1 million chair or a life-changing innovation. John Heskett also pointed out that the word design fulfills many different roles grammatically as a noun, a verb, and so on. And he summed up the complications with this seemingly ridiculous but grammatically correct sentence: design is to design a design to produce a design. Now, that to me again brilliantly encapsulates the difficulty of trying to pin down what design is. Now, every word with a long history is bound to be redefined over time, reflecting the changes in different eras, from commercial opportunism to unexpected catastrophes, but very few words have ended up being as fuzzy and ambiguous as design. Yet despite all of its uncertainties, it has always had one consistent meaning. Design is an agent of change, which can help us to make sense of what is happening and to turn it to our advantage. And I would argue that this has been the elemental definition of design that has been accurate for centuries and remains accurate today. Because every design exercise sets out to change something, whether its intention is to transform the lives of millions of people or to make a marginal difference to one. And it does so systematically. At its best, it's one of the most powerful tools at our disposal to ensure that changes of any type, whether they're scientific, technical, political, economic, social, environmental, cultural, or whatever, are introduced to the world in ways that are positive and empowering rather than destructive or inhibiting. And the process that we call design existed long before a word was invented to describe it, because whenever human beings have sought to change their way of life or their surroundings, they've acted as designers. They just haven't necessarily realized that they were doing so. So this would begin with prehistoric man and women barricading their caves against predators with stones they found nearby, or sharpening the heads of their spears to make them deadlier weapons. They acted as designers by doing so, but they did so distinctively. And so did this guy. This is the man with the big black hat and the crazy sword in the middle of the painting is Blackbeard, and he was one of the most famous English pirates in the golden age of piracy in the late 17th and early 18th century. And this was a time of peace in Europe when the Atlantic trade between the Americas and Europe was flourishing. New York emerged as a very profitable black market for the spoils of piracy, and British pirates in particular, like Blackbeard, became incredibly successful. And they realized that the single most effective way to run their pirate ships was to conduct their raids peacefully. In other words, to attack other ships without wasting any ammunition or risking the lives of their crew. So the simplest way of doing that was to terrify their enemies into surrendering on sight before a single musket had been fired. And to do so, during this period, in the early years of the 18th century, pirates all over the world adopted the flag you can see in the top right-hand corner of the screen. And of course, that's the flag we all know of as the skull and crossbones. It has the image of a human skull and a pair of crossbones. And in the lawless, illiterate world of the sea, that was instantly recognizable to pirates from all over the world, most of whom couldn't read and spoke many different languages, as a symbol of death and terror. So when Blackbeard's ship approached another, they raised the skull and crossbones, so that was a signal of intent as to what they planned to do. And it communicated the intended message very clearly: surrender or you'll be very sorry, because we'll attack you horribly. And of course, it was a very effective way of achieving his objective. So centuries later, it's very easy to read the story of the skull and crossbones as a textbook example of modern communications design and a precursor of today's corporate logos. It tells us exactly what its owners want us to think of them. In the pirates' case, that they were brutal, vicious, and very frightening. But in the case of the oil company BP, British Petroleum, which has a yellow and green sunflower as its symbol, it adopted that because it wants us to think of it as a gentle, sensitive, intelligent, environmentally responsible company, when in fact we all know it was responsible for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, which is one of the greatest ecological disasters in history. And similarly, Prada has an aristocratic crest on its logo as a subtle reminder that it's been making very expensive luxury goods for well over a century. Now, not that anyone would have congratulated Blackbeard for his design acumen at the time, or that he would have dreamt of describing himself as a designer, and yet he was a brilliant communication designer, as were all the other pirates who flew that flag. And another example of what we can call accidental or instinctive design is this one. This is what's called a London poverty map, and it was a series of maps that were produced in the late years of the 19th century and the early 20th century by a man called Charles Booth. He was a very wealthy British shipping magnate who was also a poverty campaigner, and he worked in the slums of London to help the poor. The poverty of the London slums was a national scandal at the time. They were squalid, they were dirty. people were living in hideous deprivation amid vicious criminality, and the popular press ran endless sensational stories about the conditions there. And they estimated that 1 in 4 Londoners lived in poverty. Booth felt that this was a dangerous exaggeration. He thought the real number was 1 in 5, and he was worried that when the truth emerged, it would derail the whole anti-poverty campaign. So he formed a team of volunteers. They were mostly economists and social scientists, and he asked them to walk the streets of particular areas of London. This is the map where I live now. It's Shoreditch and Whitechapel. So they spoke to the people who lived there. They spoke to the policemen, to teachers, to local priests, to find out the socioeconomic status of each street. And they tabulated all this information, so they could very accurately pinpoint how many people were living in poverty there or how wealthy they were. Now, this was a very conventional academic statistical exercise, but Booth's act of design brilliance was to decide to present the findings not as a whole series of statistics that no one would have understood, but as a series of color-coded maps. And if you look at those squares of color at the bottom of the map, each of them designates the level of poverty or wealth of each street. So if you were very unlucky, you lived in a black street, which was one of the poorest streets in London. If you were very fortunate, like Booth himself, you'd live in a white or yellow street, as he did. He lived in posh, prosperous Kensington. And so by doing that, he created something that anyone, regardless of whether they knew anything about economics or sociology, could immediately understand. And they found that, in fact, poverty in London was even worse than Booth thought. 1 in 3 Londoners were living in poverty. And because the information was represented in such a clearly designed, accessible way, there was a massive national outcry of horror at the squalid conditions in London. And as a result, the government was forced to clear the slums and build decent social housing there. So the most important component of Booth's research was, of course, the accuracy of the data. Had the statistics not been accurate, it would have derailed his whole project. But it was that brilliant design idea of presenting it in such an accessible and understandable way that made it have such a phenomenal impact. So there have been and continue to be countless instinctive designers like Booth or Blackbeard who practice design almost by accident. But since the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, most people have regarded design as very differently, as something that's practiced within a professional discipline, usually within a commercial context. Because it was, of course, in that period that design was formalized by pioneering industrialists to enable them to manufacture large quantities of products at consistent quality and reasonable prices. And since the Industrial Revolution, when people have thought of a designer, they've tended to think in stereotypes. And by people, I mean the 99% of the population who aren't designers, but of course use designers' work all the time. Now, one of these stereotypes of a designer is the design dictator, like the designer behind these books. This is one of the famous Penguin paperbacks in the 1940s. Now, the design template for Penguin books was defined by the Swiss-German designer Jan Tischold, who was a brilliant, rather fearsome head of design at Penguin during that period. And he wrote a hefty book called the Penguin Compositional Rules, which specified how every element of the design of every book Penguin produced should be laid out and realized. And he insisted that everyone at the company adhered to them. He was a very imperious character, and he was very unpopular among a lot of people at Penguin because he bossed them about, particularly with the printers. They were paid by the keystroke. So in other words, they wanted to produce as much work as possible, so they were paid more money. Whereas Tischold felt that by doing so, they compromised the quality of the books. So he'd prowl around the printing presses to check that they were adhering to his rules and would complain strenuously if they weren't. And if ever a printer dared to challenge him, he'd exaggerate his German accent and pretend not to understand what they were saying. Now, another equally popular stereotype of a designer is a designer showman, like the designer of these lemon squeezers, the French designer Philippe Starck. Now, he, of course, for many, many years was probably the world's most famous designer. And he made his name in the 1980s by redesigning cafes in Paris, the city where he lives. And his signature product was a three-legged chair, which, ridiculous though it sounds now, caused a media sensation at the time. And Starck, who's a very mediagenic character, he's very witty, very charismatic, very charming, claimed that the three-legged chair was much more sensible than a four-legged one, particularly in a cafe, because there was one leg less for waiters to trip up over. Now, this may have made sense, except that the chairs were so unstable that often the cafe visitors fell on the ground onto the chairs, so the waiters tripped up over them anyway. And probably his most successful product were these lemon squeezers, which if you've been unlucky enough to use one, will know they're appallingly badly designed. I mean, the lemon juice, can't use any of it for cooking. Most of it squirts all over you, generally in your eye. And of course, the same cliche of the showman applies to fashion design, where many designers have made their names through the showmanship of their work. And this is one of the incredible pieces by the British designer Alexander McQueen, who produced such spectacular, often deeply subversive collections. But other fashion designers, of course, have made their names through their showmanship of themselves. So Karl Lagerfeld, the French, or rather German designer, would be an excellent example of that. And recently he's taken to being a showman, not so much through his own personality, but that of his cat. This is his very spoilt pet cat called Choupette. And Choupette is a social media star. Choupette has her own Twitter and Instagram pages in which she describes herself as a spoilt #Chanel pussy whose maids pamper her every need. She's got 2 personal maids who are devoted purely to her, a lavish beauty regime. Choupette has a weekly manicure. And if she accompanies her master to New York, and he won't travel without her, she has her own room at the Mercer Hotel. But she's a very smart cat. Choupette did 2 advertising campaigns, one for cosmetics, one for a car last year, and made €3 million as a result. So I'd say she's a very clever show cat indeed. Now, despite such nonsense, and fashionable though it's become to dismiss the commercial approach to design, it has, of course, achieved incredible things in its industrial guise, but it has also restricted designers to specific roles and cast design as a tool of commerce. And I would argue that this has made it more likely to be trivialized and misunderstood. As a result, design is routinely confused with styling, with expensive, uncomfortable chairs, gas-guzzling cars, or silly shoes with impossibly high heels. It's often dismissed as a ploy to trick us to buying things of questionable value, which we'll soon tire of and abandon with the rest of the toxic junk in landfill sites like this. This is the notorious Abgagloshi dump in Ghana, basically where the sort of toxic electrical and digital waste from the West is shipped out in containers and sent to pollute the land for decades to come. And all too often design is seen as an indulgence for spoiled consumers in developed economies rather than a means of helping the disadvantaged to escape from poverty. Now, none of these negative interpretations of design are new. As long ago as 1704, it was described by the Oxford English Dictionary as a crafty contrivance or a scheme formed to the detriment of another. And if you were told that I had designs on you, which is an English slang term, or on something you valued, you'd be justified in feeling alarmed, because it would mean that I was quite likely to want to steal it from you. If an object is described as a designer sofa, a designer hotel, or a designer lemon squeezer, some people might think it was so enticing that they'd be prepared to pay more for it than a standard product of the same type, or others would darkly suspect it of being a rip-off. Now, none of these stereotypes are entirely inaccurate, more's the pity, but design has much, much, much more to offer than this. And there have always been examples of gifted designers who've transcended their commercial roles by conceiving and executing their work so intelligently that it has more refined qualities too. You can think of Saul Bass's movie titles, Achille Castiglione's furniture, or Charles and Raim's educational films.